The footage was 17 minutes and 43 seconds long. 17 minutes that documented behavior I'd spent 12 years studying in wolves, bears, and mountain lions. Protective herding, threat assessment, coordinated defensive positioning, behaviors that required sophisticated cognition, social awareness, and what we carefully avoid calling in scientific literature, compassion. Except the animal displaying these behaviors wasn't in any scientific literature, wasn't supposed to exist, was something I'd been trained to dismiss as folklore, misidentification, or the desperate need humans have to believe in mysteries. My name is Dr. Marcus Webb. I'm a wildlife behavioral ecologist specializing in predator-prey dynamics in the Northern Rockies. For over a decade, I've documented how apex predators shape ecosystems, influence prey behavior, and maintain population balance through their mere presence. I understand predation. I understand survival. I understand the brutal calculus of nature. What I filmed in November 2016 didn't fit any framework I possessed. I was studying wolf predation patterns on mule deer populations in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, 2 million acres of roadless terrain straddling the Idaho-Montana border. I'd set up remote cameras at a known deer migration corridor, hoping to document how wolf presence influenced herd movement and vigilance behavior. Instead, I documented something that would cost me my career, my reputation, and my certainty about what was possible. I should have deleted the footage immediately. The Selway Bitterroot is the kind of wilderness that makes you understand how much of the planet we've lost. No roads, no cell service, grizzly bears, wolves, and mountain lions existing in densities not seen outside Alaska, weather that can kill you in any season. Terrain so rugged that even experienced backcountry travelers avoid certain drainages entirely. I'd been working there since 2012, part of a multi-year study examining how wolf reintroduction affected ungulate populations and behavior. The research was straightforward. Document predation events, track prey movement patterns, analyze how deer and elk adapted their behavior in response to predator presence. My methodology relied heavily on remote camera traps, motion-activated cameras positioned at game trails, water sources, and known bedding areas. I maintained 47 cameras across 100 square miles of wilderness, checking and servicing them every 3 weeks during a grueling circuit that required 6 days of backpacking. The camera that captured the footage was positioned at the confluence of 2 small creeks in a narrow valley at 7,200 feet elevation. I'd chosen the location because thermal imagery showed it was a concentration area for deer during late autumn, a bottleneck where topography funneled migration routes through a quarter-mile gap between cliff faces. Perfect for documenting predation, perfect for ambush. When I retrieved the camera's SD card in early December, I expected the usual. Deer passing through, the occasional elk, maybe a black bear making a last forage before denning. With luck, I might have footage of wolves testing the herd, demonstrating the predator-prey dynamics I was studying. I didn't review the footage in the field. That came later, back at my cabin in Darby, Montana, where I had power and proper equipment for analysis. The relevant sequence started at 4:47 a.m. on November 18th. The timestamp showed the sky was still dark, but the camera's infrared illumination captured everything with stark clarity. A mule deer herd, I counted 23 individuals including 6 fawns, moved through the corridor. They were nervous, heads up, ears forward, exhibiting clear predator awareness behavior. The does kept the fawns centered in the group, classic defensive positioning. At 4:51 a.m. wolves appeared, 5 individuals from the Selway pack, identifiable by their collar markings from a fish and wildlife capture operation the previous spring. They moved with the coordinated purpose of experienced hunters, positioning themselves to cut off the herd's forward movement while blocking retreat routes. The deer panicked. The formation broke. Fawns scattered. Does made the terrible calculation prey animals always make. Which offspring to defend, which to abandon. How to maximize survival when every option means loss. The wolves pressed their advantage, isolating a young doe who'd stumbled on the loose scree near the creek. And then at 4:53 a.m. something else entered the frame. It came from upslope, moving through terrain I would have considered impassable in darkness. A steep rockslide area choked with deadfall. It was massive, bipedal, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something that size. My first thought, trained by years of wildlife observation, bear. But the movement was wrong. Bears on hind legs are clumsy, unbalanced. This was fluid, purposeful, with the biomechanics of something built for upright locomotion. It positioned itself between the wolves and the isolated doe. The wolves stopped immediately. No gradual recognition of threat, instant assessment and response. They backed away, maintaining visual contact but clearly abandoning the hunt. The figure, I still didn't know what to call it, didn't attack, didn't pursue, just stood there, arms slightly spread, body language communicating something unmistakable across species boundaries. Leave. The wolves left. The doe, after a moment of frozen uncertainty, bolted back toward the herd. The figure watched her go, then turned and moved back upslope, disappearing into the darkness beyond the camera's infrared range. Total duration of the interaction, 42 seconds. I watched the footage 16 times that first night, trying to identify what I'd captured. My brain kept offering explanations: human in a costume, trick of light and shadow, equipment malfunction, anything that fit within the possible. But I'd spent 12 years watching wildlife footage. I knew real behavior from artificial staging. I knew natural movement from performance. This was real. I didn't tell anyone immediately. Instead, I did what any scientist would do. I analyzed the footage systematically, looking for explanations that didn't require accepting the impossible. Frame-by-frame examination showed clear anatomical details. Height, approximately 7.5 feet. Build, massively muscular through the shoulders and chest, with arm proportions different from human, longer relative to torso length. Locomotion, bipedal, with a gait pattern that showed clear adaptation to upright movement. The leg articulation, the foot placement, the hip rotation, all consistent with obligate bipedalism, not the occasional upright posture of a bear. The fur, or hair, I couldn't determine which, was dark brown to black, thick enough to obscure detailed body structure. But the movement suggested musculoskeletal anatomy underneath: shoulder rotation, elbow flexion, knee articulation, all visible through the motion. Most significantly, the behavior. This wasn't random. The figure had assessed the situation, identified vulnerable prey being targeted by predators, and intervened. Then, critically, it had shown restraint. No aggression toward the wolves beyond the threat display. No attempt to claim the deer for itself. Simply protection, then withdrawal. I cross-referenced the behavior with known wildlife patterns. Bears occasionally disrupt wolf kills to scavenge, but through dominance and food acquisition, not protection of prey. Mountain lions are solitary and wouldn't intervene in wolf hunts. Humans would have made noise, used tools, left obvious traces. This was something else. Something that understood predator-prey dynamics well enough to intervene strategically, that possessed enough size and presence to intimidate a wolf pack, but that showed no interest in the prey itself. The implications were staggering. Not just the existence of an unknown species, but the behavior. This suggested a level of ecological awareness and ethical decision-making I'd never documented in any non-human species. I needed verification, more data, evidence that this wasn't a singular anomaly. I reviewed footage from my other cameras, going back 6 months. Nothing as dramatic as the deer protection incident, but once I knew what to look for, I found traces. Anomalies I'd previously dismissed as equipment errors or unidentifiable wildlife. A thermal signature passing through frame at 3 a.m., too tall and too bipedal to be bear or elk. Tree branches deliberately placed across game trails in patterns that diverted deer away from known wolf ambush sites. Large, human-like footprints in mud near water sources, dismissed in my field notes as possible human intrusion. Investigate. Disturbance patterns in forest litter suggesting something large bedding down in thick cover, located between predator territories and prey concentration areas. The evidence suggested not just presence, but pattern, deliberate positioning in areas where predators and prey intersected, behavior that consistently seemed aimed at reducing predation pressure on vulnerable individuals. I returned to the site in January, winter conditions making the trip brutal but providing better tracking opportunities in snow. The area showed signs of regular use: compressed vegetation in sheltered areas, bark stripped from specific trees, food, medicine, communication, and a depression in thick brush that might have been a regular bedding site. Most significantly, I found tracks. Clear, unmistakable, 17-inch footprints in crusted snow. 5 toes. Obvious arch structure. Bipedal stride length of nearly 6 feet. I photographed them from every angle, measured them precisely, made plaster casts using materials I'd carried specifically for this purpose. I also installed 3 additional cameras in the immediate area, positioned to capture different angles of the corridor and surrounding terrain. If this was territory, if this was regular behavior, I needed more documentation. By February, I had accumulated 43 additional video clips showing similar patterns. A large bipedal figure moving through areas where predator and prey populations overlapped, behaviors that consistently seemed to reduce predation pressure. I also had a decision to make: what to do with evidence that could either revolutionize wildlife biology or destroy my credibility entirely. I decided to present the footage to colleagues first, get feedback. Scientific peer review before going public. That was my first mistake. I showed the footage to Dr. Linda Morrison at the University of Montana in early March. Linda was a colleague I trusted. We'd collaborated on previous wolf studies, published together, spent countless hours discussing wildlife behavior. She was rigorous, skeptical, and unlikely to let personal bias override data evaluation. I brought my laptop to her office, closed the door, and played the 17-minute sequence without preamble or explanation. She watched in silence. When it finished, she asked to see it again, then a third time, this one with her making notes about timestamps, behaviors, and observable details. Finally, "What am I looking at, Marcus? I was hoping you could tell me." The behavior is clear. Large animal intervening in predation event, displaying protective behavior toward prey species, showing sophisticated threat assessment and tactical positioning. The wolves' response suggests they recognized it as a legitimate threat. Immediate withdrawal, no testing or challenge. And the animal itself? She was quiet for a long moment. If this is genuine, and I'm not saying it is, you've documented something that shouldn't exist, which means either the footage is compromised somehow, or our understanding of North American megafauna is incomplete. I have additional footage, tracks, thermal signatures, patterns of behavior suggesting regular territorial presence in areas where ungulate populations concentrate. Show me everything. I spent 3 hours walking her through my evidence. The additional camera footage, the track photographs and casts, the behavioral patterns, the ecological implications of a large omnivore or herbivore that actively interfered with predation dynamics. Linda's scientific skepticism was evident, but so was her intellectual honesty. This deserves serious investigation. But Marcus, you understand what happens if you go public with this? The media circus, the credibility questions, the impact on your research funding? I understand. But if this is real, if there's a viable population of unknown hominids in the Selway Bitterroot, that's the most significant wildlife discovery in a century. It changes everything we understand about North American ecology, evolution, and conservation priorities. It also changes everything about how we manage these wilderness areas. Logging, mining, recreation, predator control. All of it gets complicated if we're protecting habitat for something that isn't supposed to exist. She had a point. The economic and political implications were enormous. The Selway Bitterroot was already contentious. Environmentalists fighting to maintain roadless designation, extractive industries pushing for access, ranchers concerned about wolf predation on livestock. Add an unknown primate species to that mix and the conflicts would escalate exponentially. We need more data, Linda said. More cameras, longer observation periods, ideally some physical evidence beyond tracks, hair samples, scat, something that can be DNA tested, and we need to keep this quiet until we have enough evidence to withstand inevitable scrutiny. We developed a plan: expand the camera network, focus on high-probability areas, document systematically for at least 6 more months before considering publication. Linda would provide equipment and technical support. I would conduct fieldwork and analysis. It felt manageable, scientific, appropriately cautious. Then, 2 weeks later, someone leaked the footage online. I never discovered who. Linda swore it wasn't her. It might have been a graduate student who'd seen the footage on Linda's computer. It might have been IT staff who'd handled my data backups. It might have been someone at the camera manufacturer who'd seen the footage during a warranty claim I'd filed. Whoever it was, they uploaded the 17-minute sequence to YouTube with the title, "Bigfoot Protects Deer from Wolves. Real Footage from Idaho Wilderness." Within 24 hours, it had 3 million views. Within 48 hours, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Within 72 hours, my life as a credible wildlife biologist was effectively over. The response was immediate, overwhelming, and polarized. True believers hailed it as definitive proof. Skeptics called it an obvious hoax. Media outlets requested interviews. Cryptozoology groups offered funding. My university received hundreds of emails demanding everything from my promotion to my termination. The footage went viral in that peculiar internet way, where everyone has an opinion and few have expertise. Reddit threads analyzing every frame. YouTube channels with millions of subscribers breaking down the video pixel by pixel. CGI experts claiming they could recreate it easily. Wildlife biologists I'd never met publicly questioning my competence. Dr. Morrison released a statement. While the footage shows interesting animal behavior, definitive species identification requires physical evidence beyond video documentation. We encourage rigorous scientific analysis rather than premature conclusions. Diplomatic, carefully worded, essentially backing away from any association with my claims. The university was less diplomatic. I was called into a meeting with the dean of the College of Natural Resources, 3 administrators, 2 lawyers, and a PR consultant whose job was clearly damage control. Dr. Webb, we need to discuss the recent media attention surrounding your research. I documented unusual wildlife behavior in the course of legitimate fieldwork. The footage leaked without my permission. Regardless of how it became public, it's now associated with this institution. We're receiving complaints from donors, questions from accrediting agencies, and mockery on social media. This affects our reputation and our funding. The footage is genuine. The behavior is documented. Whether people believe it or not doesn't change the data. The PR consultant leaned forward. Dr. Webb, public perception matters. Your footage is being shared alongside videos of obvious hoaxes, costume pranks, and pseudoscientific nonsense. By association, you're undermining the credibility of legitimate wildlife research. So you want me to what? Retract documented observations because they're inconvenient? We want you to acknowledge the possibility of misidentification, equipment error, or insufficient evidence for definitive conclusions. We want you to be more careful about the claims you make and how they reflect on this institution. I made no claims. I showed footage of documented behavior to a colleague for scientific evaluation. Someone else leaked it and created the controversy. Nevertheless, you're now at the center of that controversy, and we need to consider how your continued association with this topic affects the university's reputation and research funding. The implication was clear. Distance yourself from the footage or face professional consequences. I refused. I'm a scientist. I document observations and analyze data. I won't deny what I recorded because it's controversial. The meeting ended with a vague warning about reviewing my research protocols and considering future grant applications more carefully. But the real damage was already done. Within 2 weeks, my current grant funding was paused pending review of methodology and equipment reliability. 2 graduate students working with me requested transfers to other advisors. A scheduled paper on wolf predation patterns was rejected by the journal that had previously accepted it, with reviewer comments suggesting my recent publicity-seeking raised questions about research integrity. 3 speaking invitations for wildlife conferences were quietly rescinded. Dr. Morrison stopped returning my calls. Meanwhile, the public attention intensified. Cryptozoology groups organized expeditions to the Selway Bitterroot, flooding the wilderness with amateur researchers carrying cameras and making enough noise to drive away any legitimate wildlife. The Forest Service issued statements discouraging Bigfoot tourism and warning about wilderness hazards. My research site, the specific corridor where I'd filmed the footage, became ground zero for trespassers. My carefully positioned cameras were stolen or vandalized. The scientific study I'd spent 4 years developing was effectively destroyed by the attention my documentation had generated, and through it all, one question haunted me. Had I made things worse? Had revealing the footage endangered the very creature I'd documented by bringing attention to its territory and behavior? The protective behavior I'd filmed suggested something capable of sophisticated reasoning and ethical consideration, something that chose to help vulnerable prey rather than exploit them, and I'd responded by exposing it to exactly the kind of exploitation it had been avoiding. In May, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside, a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph showed my camera, the one from the original deer protection footage, smashed and partially buried under rocks, not damaged by bears or weather, deliberately destroyed and concealed. The note in careful block letters. They know about the cameras, they're leaving, you did this. No signature, No indication of who'd sent it or how they'd accessed the site. But the implication was clear. Someone was monitoring the area, and the subjects of my footage were changing their behavior in response to the increased human presence. I hiked back to the site in June, violating the university's instruction to suspend my field research. The area was transformed. Where I'd previously documented regular use, compressed vegetation, stripped bark, bedding sites, there was now nothing. The animals had cleaned up after themselves, or the weather had erased the traces, or I'd been wrong about the patterns in the first place. My remaining cameras showed only typical wildlife: deer, elk, bears, wolves. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested presence of anything beyond known species. They'd left, or they'd learned to avoid my cameras. Either way, the behavior I'd documented was gone. I expanded my search, hiking to adjacent drainages and remote areas where human presence was even less common. I found scattered evidence, possible tracks, ambiguous disturbances, trees with bark stripped in patterns that might have been bare or might have been something else, but nothing definitive, nothing that would constitute proof. In one remote valley, 12 miles from the nearest trail, I found something that stopped me cold. A deer carcass, weeks old, partially scavenged, but positioned near it, arranged with clear intentionality, were bones from previous kills. Arranged, not scattered, organized by type, skulls in one area, long bones in another, ribs in a third, a burial site, or a memorial, or something that suggested awareness of death as a concept, rather than just an event. I photographed it but didn't disturb the arrangement. Whatever this was, whoever had created it, they'd done so with purpose. Interfering felt like desecration. That night, camped in the valley, I heard vocalizations, deep, resonant sounds that echoed off the ridges. Not quite animal, not quite human. Communication clearly, though I couldn't decipher the meaning. They seemed to come from multiple directions, suggesting several individuals in coordinated positions around the valley. I didn't move, didn't try to record, didn't reach for my camera. I just listened. The sounds continued for perhaps 10 minutes, then ceased. The silence that followed felt weighted, pregnant with attention. I had the unmistakable sensation of being watched, evaluated, and ultimately dismissed as either threat or irrelevance. By morning, I'd made a decision. I hiked out and returned to Missoula. I met with the dean and formally resigned my position, citing irreconcilable differences in research philosophy. I closed my office, packed my equipment, and terminated my affiliation with the university. Then I held a press conference. 6 months ago, I documented unusual wildlife behavior in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. The footage was leaked without my permission and became the center of controversy that was never my intention. I want to make 2 statements today. First, the footage is genuine. It documents real behavior by an unidentified animal. I stand by the integrity of my documentation and analysis. Second, I'm ending all research related to this subject. Whatever exists in that wilderness has survived by remaining hidden. My documentation, despite my intentions, has brought exactly the kind of attention that threatens that survival. The most ethical action I can take is to stop, to leave them alone, to advocate for protecting their habitat without specifying exactly what we're protecting. Science demands we document and publish our observations, but ethics demands we consider the consequences of that documentation. Sometimes the most important discovery is the one we choose not to pursue. The press conference generated another wave of attention. Theories about government pressure, accusations of cover-up, conspiracy theories about what I'd really seen. I responded to none of it. The aftermath was predictable and depressing. Wildlife advocacy groups split into factions. Some supported my call for habitat protection without disclosure. Others demanded full transparency and scientific investigation. A few accused me of fabricating the entire incident for attention and then retreating when challenged. The Forest Service faced pressure from multiple directions. Cryptozoology enthusiasts demanded access to conduct their own research. Environmental groups pushed for expanded wilderness protections. Extractive industries argued that unverified claims shouldn't influence management decisions. Local communities worried about tourism impacts and regulatory restrictions. The compromise was bureaucratic and unsatisfying. The area around my original research site was designated as sensitive wildlife habitat, with seasonal closures and permit requirements for backcountry access. No specific species was named, no acknowledgement of what we were actually protecting. It was enough to reduce casual traffic, but not enough to prevent determined individuals from accessing the area. The media attention spawned documentaries, podcasts, and endless YouTube analysis. My footage was dissected by everyone from Hollywood CGI artists to wildlife biologists to people with no relevant expertise whatsoever. The consensus among skeptics: elaborate hoax. The consensus among believers: definitive proof. Neither side engaged with what I considered the important question: what were the ethical implications if the footage was real? I moved to a small cabin outside Salmon, Idaho, and took a job with Idaho Fish and Game doing unglamorous wildlife surveys, deer population estimates, habitat assessments, the kind of work that generated data without controversy. Dr. Morrison published a paper on wolf predation patterns, using some of my pre-controversy data, but carefully omitting any mention of the footage or unusual observations. It was accepted by a major wildlife journal and received positive reviews. She'd successfully distanced herself from the scandal and preserved her reputation. I didn't resent her for it. She'd made the rational professional choice. But I received occasional communications from others who'd made different choices. A wildlife officer in British Columbia sent me trail camera footage of something bipedal at a salmon stream, too tall to be human, behavior suggesting fishing technique. A forest ranger in Northern California shared tracks she'd found, 17 inches long, with dermal ridges that didn't match any known species. A PhD student in Montana contacted me about her dissertation research on anomalous wildlife observations and the social construction of credibility in field biology. She interviewed me for 3 hours, asking thoughtful questions about how scientific communities manage observations that don't fit existing frameworks. "Do you regret documenting it?" she asked near the end. "I regret how it was handled. I regret the attention it brought to their territory. I regret that I couldn't control the narrative or protect them from exploitation. But the documentation itself? No. Scientists document what they observe. That's the job. But I've learned that documentation alone isn't neutral. It has consequences. And sometimes those consequences mean the most ethical choice is silence." She included that quote in her dissertation. It was later cited in debates about research ethics, indigenous knowledge, and the politics of scientific disclosure. But the real test came 18 months after my resignation, when hunters reported a possible Bigfoot sighting 40 miles north of my original research site. The description matched. Large, bipedal, dark fur, behavior suggesting high intelligence. Media outlets contacted me for comment. Cryptozoology groups invited me to consult on investigations. Documentary filmmakers offered money for interviews. I declined everything, whatever was out there, and I remained convinced something was. It deserved to exist without becoming the subject of human obsession. My footage had already damaged that possibility. I wouldn't compound the harm by encouraging further pursuit. The hunter's report faded from public attention within a week, replaced by newer sensations and more immediate controversies, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. I returned to the Selway Bitterroot one final time in autumn 2017, exactly 1 year after the original footage, not to the original site. That area remained compromised by human traffic despite the seasonal closures. Instead, I hiked to a remote drainage on the Montana side, an area I'd scouted years earlier but never fully explored. 3 days in, 3 days out, traveling light and leaving no trace. I brought no cameras, no recording equipment, no means of documentation beyond a field notebook I had no intention of sharing. The landscape was entering that liminal space between seasons. Autumn colors fading, first snow dusting the high ridges, animals preparing for winter's privation. The forest felt both alive and suspended, waiting for the transformation that would make survival the only concern. On the second day, I found signs. Not obvious, nothing that would catch casual attention, but to someone who'd spent months learning to see traces invisible to most observers. A branch deliberately placed across a game trail, at a height that would redirect deer, but allow larger animals to pass beneath. Bark stripped from a specific tree species at a height requiring significant reach. A bedding depression in thick brush, positioned to overlook a meadow where elk congregated. Someone was here, someone who understood the landscape, the wildlife, the seasonal patterns. Someone who was currently watching me from somewhere I couldn't identify. That evening, I made camp in a small clearing near a creek. I built a fire, small, controlled, positioned to minimize impact. I prepared a simple meal, then sat watching the flames as darkness settled over the forest. I spoke aloud, feeling foolish but needing to say it. I'm not here to document you, not here to prove you exist or study your behavior. I'm here to apologize. The forest absorbed my words without response. Somewhere distant, an owl called. The creek murmured over stones. Wind moved through the canopy with a sound like breathing. I showed people what I saw. I thought truth mattered more than privacy. I was wrong. The attention I brought has made your life harder, has forced you to leave places you've used for generations, has turned your home into a destination for people who see you as puzzle or prize or proof. I paused, watching sparks rise into darkness. I can't undo that. Can't take back the footage or make people forget, but I can stop. I can refuse to participate in the exploitation. I can protect what remains of your privacy by refusing to violate it further. Still no response. But the quality of silence shifted, from the empty quiet of an abandoned landscape to the watchful stillness of attentive presence. I stayed by the fire for another hour, then banked the coals and retreated to my tent. I didn't sleep well, hyper-aware of every sound, every movement of air, every sensation that might indicate proximity. Near dawn I heard it, close, perhaps 30 feet from my tent, the same deep, modulated vocalization I'd heard the year before in the other valley. A sound that carried meaning beyond my ability to translate, but communicated something I understood instinctively. Acknowledgement. Not forgiveness, not approval, but recognition that I'd heard and was responding. When I emerged at first light, I found a gift near my extinguished fire, a branch freshly broken placed deliberately across 2 stones, and resting in the fork, 3 pine cones, arranged with obvious intentionality. I understood. It was the same protective gesture I'd filmed, objects deliberately placed to communicate meaning. In this case, balance, exchange, recognition of my attempt at restitution. I left the arrangement untouched and hiked out that morning. I never published the research, never wrote the paper that would have detailed behavioral observations of an unknown North American hominid, never pursued the academic recognition that documenting such a discovery might have brought. The footage remains online, endlessly analyzed and debated. Some people believe it, most don't. I've stopped correcting misinterpretations or defending its authenticity. Let it exist as ambiguity, interesting enough to generate discussion, inconclusive enough to avoid definitive exploitation. I still work in wildlife biology, but I've changed how I approach documentation. I'm more careful about what I record, what I publish, what I make available to public scrutiny. Some observations I've learned serve conservation better by remaining unpublished field notes rather than peer-reviewed papers. Other researchers have contacted me quietly over the years. A biologist in Washington who's documented similar protective behaviors near elk herds. A forest ranger in Oregon who's found structures that suggest tool use and aesthetic preference. A wildlife photographer in British Columbia who captured something in the background of a grizzly bear photo. Something bipedal and observant that she's chosen not to enhance or publicize. We form an informal network of people who've seen evidence of something that officially doesn't exist, and who've chosen documentation over disclosure, protection over proof. The irony isn't lost on me. Science demands transparency, replicability, public evidence. By choosing silence, we're violating core principles of scientific practice, but we're honoring something more fundamental. The right of intelligent beings to exist without human interference, to maintain privacy, agency, and self-determination without requiring our permission or documentation. The footage I captured showed protection, an unknown being intervening to prevent harm to vulnerable prey. The least I can do is extend the same consideration, protect them by not exposing them to harm. I think about that moment constantly, the wolves backing away, the deer rejoining the herd, the figure watching to ensure safety, then withdrawing without claiming reward or recognition, behavior that suggested empathy, ethics, and a relationship with the ecosystem based on something other than pure survival. If such beings exist, and I remain convinced they do, they represent an alternative way of being in the world, not dominating nature, but participating in it, not extracting resources but maintaining balance, not requiring proof of their existence, but simply living with dignity in the remaining wild places. We could learn from that. We could recognize that not everything needs to be known, documented, and controlled. That mystery has value, that some frontiers should remain unexplored not because we lack the capability, but because we possess the wisdom to abstain. The footage ended, with the figure disappearing back into darkness. That's where they should remain, not because they're not real, but because their reality doesn't require our validation. I keep the pine cones from that final morning in my office, 3 small objects arranged with intention, representing an exchange across a divide I can never fully bridge. A reminder that some communications transcend language, some relationships exist without documentation, and some truths are honored better through silence than through speech. The forest still holds its secrets, and I've become a guardian of those secrets rather than their exposer. That's not the career I imagined when I started studying wildlife behavior, but it might be the most important work I've ever done.